There's a belief, quiet, ancient, deeply embedded, that you were born broken. Not that you did something wrong, but that you are something wrong. And if you grew up inside certain religious traditions, that belief didn't stay abstract. It became your inner voice. It became the way you talk to yourself at 2 a.m. It became the reason you apologized for simply existing. You are a sinner, not just sometimes, always, by nature. But here's what no one tells you. Psychologists have a name for what happens to a mind that accepts this as truth. And it is not enlightenment, it is not humility, it is damage. Today, we're going to walk through exactly what that belief does to the human psyche, layer by layer. And by the end, you may never see guilt, shame, or religion the same way again. The doctrine of original sin, and why it was never really about theology. Most people think original sin is a theological idea. A story about a garden, an apple, a snake. Something you read about and file away as ancient mythology or inherited doctrine. But that framing lets us off too easily, because the story is not just sitting in a book somewhere, it is sitting inside people. It is shaping how they wake up in the morning, how they speak to themselves after a mistake, how they relate to love, to pleasure, to the basic experience of being alive. You are told, often before you can read, that you entered this world guilty, not that you did something wrong, that you arrived wrong, that the very fact of your existence carries a moral debt you did not accumulate and cannot simply pay off. Augustine of Hippo formalized this doctrine in the 4th century, drawing from Paul's letters and weaving them into a theological framework that would define Western Christianity for over 1,000 years. It spread not because it was scientifically verifiable or philosophically airtight, but because it was extraordinarily useful. A person who believes they are inherently broken will seek repair. And if you control the repair shop, you control the person. That is not cynicism. That is just the logic of institutional power, and it is played out across centuries with remarkable consistency. What makes this particularly interesting from a psychological standpoint is what happens when that doctrine gets internalized. It stops being a belief you hold and becomes a lens you see through. The guilt is no longer a response to something you did. It becomes a baseline emotional state, a kind of ambient shame that follows you regardless of your actions. Good behavior does not dissolve it. Kindness does not neutralize it. Because the problem was never your behavior. The problem, according to this framework, is your nature. It was not designed to set you free. It was designed to make freedom feel dangerous. And here's the part that should genuinely unsettle you. The psychological architecture of that belief continues running in millions of people long after the theology itself has faded. You do not have to still believe in original sin to still be living inside its emotional logic. That gap between the doctrine and its damage is what this whole video is really about. But what does it actually feel like to live inside that architecture every single day? That is where it gets disturbing. Chronic shame is not humility. It's a wound with a holy name. There is a difference between guilt and shame. It sounds like a small distinction. It is not. That difference may be one of the most important things psychology has given us in the last 50 years, and understanding it changes how you see almost everything we are going to talk about in this video. Guilt says, I did something wrong. Shame says, I am something wrong. Guilt is functional. It points at a specific behavior, a particular moment, something you can examine and address. You can apologize for what you did. You can repair the damage. You can decide to act differently and carry that decision forward. There is a clear path from guilt to growth. Psychologists describe guilt as a pro-social emotion precisely because it orients you toward repair rather than collapse. Shame works completely differently. Shame does not point at what you did, it points at who you are. And you cannot fix who you are, you can only hide it. You can perform better in public while the belief quietly poisons you in private. You can smile and serve and appear devoted while something underneath remains convinced that the devotion itself is hollow because the person doing it is hollow. Psychologist Brené Brown spent years researching the effects of shame across thousands of people. Her finding was stark and consistent. Shame correlates with addiction, depression, aggression, and suicide. Guilt, interestingly, does not carry those same correlations, because guilt can become action. Shame becomes identity. Now consider what certain theological traditions do with this distinction. They do not separate guilt from shame. They collapse them together and tell you the shame is correct. That feeling small, broken, and unworthy in the eyes of God is not a pathological state. It is the beginning of wisdom. The very feeling that psychologists identify as a wound gets rebranded as spiritual virtue. That is not religion healing a wound. That is religion naming the wound a virtue and calling the pain enlightenment. And because the shame is framed as holy, the person experiencing it has no permission to question it. To push back is to be prideful. To seek relief is to be spiritually immature. The wound stays open, and the person stays inside it, believing the bleeding is a sign they are finally doing something right. And the cruelest part is this: the people inside that system rarely know they are suffering, because the suffering has been rebranded as devotion. The thought police inside your own head. Here is something that rarely gets discussed when people talk about religious guilt. In many theological frameworks, sin does not just live in your actions, it lives in your thoughts. This is not a fringe interpretation. It is central to how certain traditions define moral failure, and it creates a psychological environment unlike almost anything else a person can inhabit. Lust is a sin. Envy is a sin. Doubt is a sin. Pride is a sin. Which means the moment a natural human impulse arises in your mind, attraction, curiosity, ambition, self-respect, a judgment immediately follows it. That was wrong. You are wrong. The thought itself becomes evidence of your corruption. You did not act on it. You may have immediately tried to push it away. None of that matters. The thought appeared, and appearing was enough. Psychologists have a name for this cognitive pattern. It is called thought-action fusion. It is the distortion of believing that having a thought is morally equivalent to committing the act. If I think something violent, I am violent. If I feel attracted to someone I should not be attracted to, I have already betrayed everyone who trusts me. This pattern is well documented in clinical literature, most prominently as a feature of obsessive-compulsive disorder. People with OCD who experience intrusive thoughts are tormented precisely because they assign moral weight to the presence of the thought rather than the content of their character. And now consider that certain religious frameworks do not treat this as a disorder to be treated. They treat it as a correct moral framework to be embraced. Think about what that does to a developing mind over years and decades. Every moment of natural human experience gets tagged with a moral alarm. You cannot have a feeling without immediately prosecuting it. You cannot be curious without wondering if the curiosity is dangerous. You cannot want something without asking whether the wanting itself is an act of rebellion against God. You become the accused and the judge simultaneously, and the verdict is always the same. The trial never ends, because the thoughts never stop, because you are human. And that is the deepest cruelty of the whole arrangement. The very thing that makes you human, a rich and complex inner life, becomes the primary evidence against you. And this internal trial eventually does something even more insidious. It does not stay inside you. It begins to reshape the way you see every other person around you. When you believe you're corrupt, you start to see corruption everywhere. There is a psychological phenomenon called projection. The parts of yourself you cannot accept, the impulses you have been taught to suppress and feel ashamed of, have to go somewhere. And they often go outward. You begin to see, in other people, the very things you are most afraid of in yourself. The person who has been told their desires are sinful becomes acutely suspicious of other people's desires. The person told their anger is corrupt becomes hypersensitive to anger in those around them. This is not a moral failing. It is a predictable psychological response to years of internal suppression. Now take that mechanism and combine it with the explicit theology of universal sinfulness. Everyone around you is also a sinner. That is not a peripheral belief in these frameworks. It is foundational. No one is genuinely good. Goodness is either a performance or a gift from God that can be withdrawn at any moment. Which means that when you look at the person who is kind to you, there is always a question underneath. Why are they doing this, and what do they want? Their generosity is suspect. Their warmth might be manipulation. Their confidence might be pride, which is itself a sin. The theology gives you a framework for distrusting everyone, including the people who love you most. Some traditions celebrate this as discernment, the spiritual ability to see beneath the surface of things, to recognize corruption where others only see charm. But here is the psychological reality. A mind that has been trained to look for sin in everything will find it in everything. Not because sin is everywhere, but because the human brain is extraordinarily capable of finding what it has been primed to look for. Psychologists call this confirmation bias, and it operates at a level well below conscious thought. You are not choosing to see darkness. You have been trained to see it automatically. You do not see the world as it is. You see the world as you are. And the loneliness that produces is profound. You are surrounded by people you cannot fully trust, in a world you cannot fully enjoy, living inside a story where everyone, including yourself, is fundamentally compromised. That is not a spiritual insight. That is isolation, with a theological justification attached to it. But what no doctrine fully prepares you for is what happens when forgiveness itself becomes the mechanism that keeps you trapped. The forgiveness loop, a cycle designed not to end. Let's trace the architecture carefully, because it matters. You sin, consciously or not. You feel guilt and shame. You confess, or pray, or seek absolution. You receive forgiveness. You feel relief, real, genuine, profound relief, and then time passes. You sin again, because you are human, and this was always inevitable. The shame returns. You confess again. The loop restarts. On the surface, this looks like a healing system. Transgression, followed by repentance, followed by grace. It is the structure of redemption, and it is genuinely beautiful as an idea. But look closer at what the loop actually requires to keep functioning. It requires you to perpetually return. It requires your ongoing guilt as the price of admission. Every cycle begins with your brokenness and ends with your dependence on an external source of repair. You never graduate from the loop. You never arrive at a place of settled wholeness where the cycle simply stops being necessary. The best outcome available to you is a better quality of shame and a faster path to confession. The destination is never self-sufficiency. The destination is managed dependency. Behavioral psychology has a name for this kind of reinforcement structure. It is called a variable reward schedule. The reward, in this case forgiveness, and the relief that comes with it, arrives unpredictably, not every time you seek it in the same way, not on a fixed timeline, but with enough regularity to keep you coming back. Variable reward schedules are the most psychologically addictive pattern known to researchers. They are the mechanism behind gambling. They are the reason people stay in relationships that harm them. The intermittent kindness is what makes the intermittent cruelty bearable. The relief is real. That is exactly what makes the trap so difficult to see. When you feel genuinely restored after confession or prayer, that experience is not fake. The emotional release is authentic. But the system that produced the shame in the first place remains intact, and it will produce more shame on schedule. The kindness of the forgiveness makes the cruelty of the shame feel not just acceptable, but spiritually correct. You begin to associate your suffering with sincerity and your relief with grace, which means the suffering itself starts to feel like proof that you are taking your faith seriously. And somewhere inside that loop, over years and years, something remarkable and devastating happens to your sense of who you actually are. The erasure of self, when humility becomes self-destruction. There is a word that comes up constantly in communities shaped by this theology: surrender. Surrender your will, surrender your pride, die to yourself so that something greater can live through you. Lose your life to find it. Empty yourself so that grace can fill what remains. And if you strip that language of its specific religious context, you can hear something genuinely meaningful inside it. The loosening of ego, the release of rigid self-centeredness, the willingness to be changed by something beyond your own preferences. Those are real spiritual and psychological movements. They show up across traditions, from Buddhist teaching on non-attachment to Sufi mysticism to the great contemplatives of Christian history. There is a surrender that is genuinely liberating. But surrender inside the framework of constant sinfulness takes on a completely different psychological shape. It does not mean releasing rigid attachment to outcomes. It means learning to distrust your own inner life as a primary source of guidance. Your instincts are not trustworthy because they are corrupted by sin. Your desires are not reliable because desire itself is suspect. Your emotional responses, your intuitions, your sense of what feels right or wrong, all of it must be filtered through external authority before it can be acted on. Because you, left to your own devices, will default towards sin. That is the premise. That is the operating assumption. Psychologists who work with survivors of religious trauma return to the same theme repeatedly. Patients who have spent years inside these systems often report a profound difficulty distinguishing what they actually want from what they have been told to want. Not because they are unintelligent, because for years, having preferences was framed as pride, and pride was a sin. Wanting things was evidence of corruption. So they learned to silence the wanting before it could fully form, to preemptively suppress their own voice in order to remain spiritually acceptable. The self did not surrender. The self was quietly, methodically dismantled. And that is not what liberation looks like. That is what learned helplessness looks like. It is the psychological profile of someone who has been taught, over years of patient repetition, that their inner life is the enemy, that the most dangerous thing in the room is their own perception, which leaves them entirely dependent on outside authority for basic self-knowledge. And that dependency, of course, is exactly what the system requires to keep functioning. Which raises a harder and darker question. What happens when this process begins not in adulthood, but in early childhood, before a person even has a self to dismantle? What it does to children, the wound that hides in plain sight. Children cannot consent to metaphysical frameworks. This seems obvious when you say it aloud, but we rarely follow that observation to its full implications. A child cannot evaluate theological claims. They do not have the cognitive development, the life experience, or the emotional vocabulary to weigh competing interpretations of human nature. They cannot sit with original sin as one philosophical position among many and decide whether they find it convincing. They simply absorb whatever they are given, in whatever emotional register it arrives, and they build their internal world around it. What a child absorbs, when this doctrine is taught early and often and with conviction, is a foundational orientation toward themselves. I am not enough. I have never been enough. There is something wrong with me at a level deeper than behavior, deeper than effort, deeper than anything I can address or improve. I require external rescue just to be acceptable. That is not a lesson about behavior. That is a lesson about identity. And it arrives before the identity has fully formed, which means it does not get filed alongside other beliefs. It gets woven into the structure underneath all the other beliefs. Developmental psychologist Erik Erikson mapped the stages of psychological formation, and he identified the earliest years as the critical window for building what he called basic trust. The foundational sense that the world is navigable, that relationships are safe, and most importantly, that the self is valid. When that period is instead saturated with messaging about inherent corruption, the effect is not spiritual depth. It is a fractured foundation. The child does not learn that they sometimes fail to live up to their own values. They learn that their existence is the failure. Research on religious trauma in adults consistently traces the wound back to this, the age at which the child first learned that their nature, not their actions, was the problem. And the tragedy is that the adults delivering this message often love the children deeply. They are not trying to cause harm. They are transmitting what they themselves were taught inside a framework that frames the transmission as an act of love and care. The wound passes through generations not because anyone is cruel, but because the wound has been given a name that makes it sound like a gift. That is perhaps the most quietly devastating thing about all of this. The damage wears the face of devotion, and by the time the child is old enough to question it, it already feels like the truth. But here is where it gets complicated. Not everyone who leaves the faith escapes the framework, and some carry it for the rest of their lives without ever knowing it is still there. The ghost that stays, secular life with a religious shadow. Many people leave the faith. The process looks different for everyone. Some leave loudly, in a rupture of doubt or disillusionment. Some simply drift away, the services less frequent, the prayers more hollow, until one day they realize they stopped believing somewhere along the road and cannot pinpoint exactly when. Some leave intellectually while staying physically, sitting in pews or attending rituals out of family obligation long after the conviction has gone. However it happens, there is a moment where the conscious belief dissolves. The theology no longer holds. The framework no longer convinces. And then, alone at night, after a mistake, after a moment of anger or unexpected desire or simple human selfishness, the old voice returns. Not in the language of the doctrine. Not quoting scripture or invoking God, just as a feeling, a tone, a familiar weight settling back into place. You are bad. This is your nature. You were never going to be good enough. The belief has outlived the faith that produced it. It no longer needs the scaffolding of theology because it long since stopped being a belief. It became a pattern, a way of processing experience that happens automatically, below the level of conscious reasoning, in the part of the nervous system that was shaped before the person had the tools to push back. Therapists working in this area have a term for it: religious residue, the emotional and cognitive patterns that persist after the conscious belief system has been abandoned. They show up as perfectionism that exhausts you and can never be satisfied. They show up as relentless people-pleasing, the compulsive need to earn your place in every room. They show up as chronic guilt over ordinary pleasures, the strange shadow of shame that follows a good meal, or a lazy afternoon, or a relationship that feels too easy. They show up as the inability to receive love straightforwardly, because somewhere underneath you are still waiting for the moment you are found out. The content of the belief changed. The architecture remained. And this is precisely why this conversation extends far beyond religion. This is about how early narrative shapes adult psychology at a structural level, about who gets to define what you are in the years before you can define yourself, about the stories that arrive in childhood wearing the authority of absolute truth, because those stories do not stay as stories. They become the ground you stand on, and when the ground was laid by a story that said you were born broken, you spend years trying to build something stable on a foundation that keeps shifting beneath your feet. So what is the actual alternative? Not the easy answer, the real one. That is where we are going next. The radical act of believing you are not fundamentally broken. Here is a proposition that, depending on your background, might feel arrogant, spiritually immature, or outright dangerous. You are not broken by default. You did not arrive in this world as a moral debt waiting to be repaid. You were not born guilty of something a distant ancestor supposedly did in a garden at the beginning of time. You are a conscious human being, capable of tremendous harm and extraordinary kindness, and you get to take responsibility for the specific things you actually do, rather than carrying perpetual shame for the crime of being alive. This is not a soft position. It is not naive optimism that pretends human beings are uniformly good, or that harm does not happen, or that accountability does not matter. Psychologist Carl Rogers spent decades building a therapeutic model grounded in the exact opposite of this shame framework. He called the core principle unconditional positive regard, the belief that the human being, at their foundation, has worth that does not need to be earned, repaired, or granted by an outside authority. That worth is not contingent on behavior. It is not awarded for sufficient contrition. It simply is. And the clinical results of building therapy on that premise, compared to shame-based approaches, were not even close. Accountability without self-worth does not produce moral growth. It produces self-destruction. You cannot genuinely repair what you secretly believe does not deserve repair. You cannot sustain ethical behavior out of a conviction that you are fundamentally corrupt. What you can sustain is performance. The exhausting, brittle performance of someone trying to earn a worth they have never actually felt. And the moment that performance falters, as it always eventually does, the old shame is waiting. Proof, at last, of what you always suspected. Guilt over what you did can make you better. Shame over what you are only makes you smaller. The alternative to always sinning is not moral complacency. It is moral agency. It is doing good not to escape punishment, not to manage a debt you can never fully pay, but because you decided to. Because you looked honestly at the kind of person you want to be, and you chose it. That choosing feels different from compliance. It is yours in a way that compliance never is. And when you fail, as you will, the response is not fresh evidence of your corrupt nature. It is simply information. Here is where I fell short. Here is what I want to do differently. And then you move forward, without owing the failure to anyone, without performing penance for the crime of being imperfect, without waiting to be forgiven back into acceptable existence. You already belong here. You always did. Here is what we have covered today. A belief you are always sinning is not just a theological position. It is a psychological operating system, one that produces chronic shame instead of functional guilt. One that trains you to mistrust your own mind. One that replaces self-worth with perpetual debt. It built forgiveness into a loop that never resolves. It dismantled the self in the name of humility. It reached into childhood before consent was possible and rewrote the foundation. And for many people, it does not end when the belief ends. It lives on in the voice that returns at night, in the perfectionism that exhausts you, in the love you cannot quite receive because you never fully believed you deserved it. This video is not an attack on faith. Some religious frameworks do exactly the opposite of this. They restore worth, rebuild the self, and teach accountability without annihilation. The question was never whether this is religion. The question is, does this belief make you more fully human or less? Does it expand your capacity for love, honesty, and genuine accountability? Or does it shrink you into someone who apologizes for existing? Ask that question, keep asking it. Because the most dangerous beliefs are not the ones we reject. They are the ones we absorbed before we knew we had a choice. If this made you look at something differently, subscribe and keep questioning.